When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, the world expected justice for Hitler's war criminals. The generals who had commanded the Wehrmacht, who had planned the invasion of the Soviet Union, who had overseen some of the most brutal campaigns in history. Some faced trial at Nuremberg, others committed suicide, but dozens of Germany's highest-ranking officers simply vanished into the Soviet Union, swallowed by Stalin's prison system. These weren't just soldiers. They were field marshals, generals, and commanders who had led armies of millions. For years, their families had no idea if they were alive or dead. And what happened to them in Soviet captivity reveals a story of revenge, political calculation, and survival that's been largely forgotten. This is the story of Hitler's generals in Stalin's hands. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Nazi military machine collapsed. Millions of German soldiers laid down their arms. But where you surrendered determined your fate. If you surrendered to the Americans or British in the West, you had a chance. You'd be held in a POW camp, processed, and eventually sent home. Most Western Allied prisoners were released within a year or two of the war's end. But if you surrendered to the Soviets in the East, your future was very different. And if you were a high-ranking officer, a general who had commanded troops on the Eastern Front, your fate was sealed the moment Soviet forces took you into custody. The numbers tell the story. Approximately 3 million German soldiers were captured by Soviet forces during and after World War II. Of those, historians estimate that between 400,000 and 1 million died in Soviet captivity. The exact number will never be known because Soviet records were incomplete and often deliberately falsified. Among those captured were some of the most senior officers in the German military. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who commanded the 6th Army at Stalingrad. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, a corps commander. General Helmuth Weidling, the last commander of Berlin. Dozens of other generals, lieutenant generals, and major generals. These were men who had commanded armies, planned campaigns, and made decisions that affected millions of lives. The Soviets had a special interest in these high-ranking officers. They weren't just prisoners of war. They were symbols of the Nazi regime that had invaded the Soviet Union, killed millions of Soviet citizens, and nearly destroyed the Soviet state. Stalin wanted them, and he wanted them to suffer. To understand what happened to these men, you need to know who they were and how they ended up in Soviet hands. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was perhaps the most famous. He commanded the German 6th Army at the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Between August 1942 and February 1943, the 6th Army was surrounded and slowly destroyed by Soviet forces. Hitler ordered Paulus to fight to the last man. He even promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, knowing that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. But on January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered anyway. He and his staff were taken into Soviet custody. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Paulus would spend the next 12 years in Soviet captivity. General Helmuth Weidling commanded the defense of Berlin in the final days of the war. As Soviet forces closed in on Hitler's bunker in April 1945, Weidling was given the impossible task of defending the city with a ragtag collection of exhausted soldiers, Hitler Youth, and old men. On May 2, 1945, after Hitler's suicide, Weidling surrendered Berlin to the Soviets. He was immediately taken into custody and would spend the next 10 years as a prisoner. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach was a corps commander at Stalingrad who had urged Paulus to disobey Hitler's orders and break out of the encirclement. When Paulus refused, Seydlitz was captured along with the rest of the 6th Army. Unlike many of his fellow officers, Seydlitz would eventually cooperate with the Soviets, joining the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German POWs who opposed Hitler. This cooperation would save his life, but it would also make him a traitor in the eyes of many Germans. General Ferdinand Heim commanded a panzer corps at Stalingrad. He was captured in November 1942 and spent 13 years in Soviet captivity. General Hans Valentin Hube commanded the 14th Panzer Corps and was one of Hitler's favorite generals, but he died in a plane crash in 1944 before he could be captured. General Otto Corfis was captured at Stalingrad and, like Seydlitz, eventually joined the National Committee for a Free Germany. There were dozens more. General Vincenz Müller, Chief of Staff of the Fourth Army, captured in June 1944. General Martin Lattmann, captured in East Prussia in 1945. General Arno von Lenski, captured in 1944. Each had commanded thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of troops. Each had been part of the Nazi war machine, and each would face years of imprisonment in the Soviet Union. The circumstances of their capture varied. Some, like Paulus, surrendered after being surrounded and cut off. Others were captured when their units were overrun in the final chaotic months of the war. A few were captured while trying to flee westward to surrender to American or British forces. But regardless of how they were captured, the result was the same. They were taken into NKVD custody, separated from their men, and transported deep into the Soviet Union. For most, it would be years before their families knew if they were alive or dead. The Soviet approach to German generals was different from their treatment of ordinary soldiers. These men were valuable. They had intelligence about German military operations, about Hitler's inner circle, about Nazi plans and strategies. The Soviets wanted that information, and they were willing to use whatever methods necessary to get it. When a German general was captured, the first thing that happened was interrogation. NKVD officers would spend days, sometimes weeks, questioning them about everything. What were German military capabilities? What were Hitler's strategic plans? What did they know about other German commanders? What were the weaknesses in German defenses? Unlike ordinary soldiers who might be interrogated once or twice, generals faced relentless questioning. The Soviets knew these men had information that could be useful, both for the ongoing war and for future political purposes. Some generals cooperated immediately, others resisted. The interrogation techniques varied. Sleep deprivation was common. So was isolation. Generals were kept in small cells, often in Moscow's Lubyanka prison or other NKVD facilities. They were given minimal food and no contact with other prisoners. The goal was to break them down psychologically, but the Soviets were also pragmatic. They knew that torturing a field marshal to death wouldn't serve their purposes. They needed these men alive, at least for a while. So, the treatment, while harsh, was generally not as brutal as what ordinary German soldiers faced. Generals received slightly better food. They had access to basic medical care. They weren't worked to death in labor camps. This doesn't mean their treatment was humane. It just means the Soviets saw them as assets rather than disposable labor. After the initial interrogations, German generals were typically sent to special camps designed specifically for high-ranking officers. The most famous was Camp 48 in Voikovo, near Moscow. This camp held dozens of German generals and senior officers. Camp 48 was not a typical gulag camp. The prisoners weren't forced to do hard labor. They weren't starved. Instead, they were kept in a kind of limbo. They lived in barracks, received adequate food, and were allowed to interact with each other. But they had no freedom, no contact with the outside world, and no idea when or if they would ever be released. The conditions at Camp 48 were tolerable by Soviet standards, but they were still prison conditions. The barracks were cold in winter, the food was monotonous, medical care was basic, and the psychological pressure was constant. The Soviets would periodically interrogate prisoners, asking the same questions over and over. They would show them propaganda about the destruction of Germany. They would tell them that their families believed they were dead. For men who had commanded armies and lived lives of privilege under the Nazi regime, this was a profound humiliation. They were stripped of their rank, their authority, and their dignity. They were just prisoners, dependent on their captors for everything. One of the most controversial aspects of German generals in Soviet captivity was the National Committee for a Free Germany, or NKFD. This was a Soviet-sponsored organization created in July 1943, made up of German POWs who agreed to oppose Hitler and call for Germany's surrender. The Soviets saw the NKFD as a propaganda tool. They wanted to show that even German officers recognized that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. They also hoped to use the NKFD to encourage German soldiers to surrender or defect. Several captured generals joined the NKFD, most notably General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach and General Vinzenz Müller. These men made radio broadcasts calling on German troops to lay down their arms. They signed manifestos denouncing Hitler. They cooperated with Soviet propaganda efforts. Why did they do it? For some, it was genuine conviction. They believed Hitler was destroying Germany and that the only way to save their country was to end the war as quickly as possible. For others, it was survival. The Soviets made it clear that cooperation would be rewarded with better treatment and, eventually, release. Refusal could mean indefinite imprisonment or worse. Field Marshal Paulus eventually joined the NKFD as well, though not until 1944, more than a year after his capture. His decision shocked many Germans. A field marshal, the highest rank in the German military, had turned against Hitler. The propaganda value was enormous, but joining the NKFD came with a price. These men were seen as traitors by many Germans, both during the war and after. When they eventually returned to Germany, they faced ostracism and accusations of betrayal. Some, like Seydlitz, were even tried for treason by West German courts, though the charges were eventually dropped. For the generals who didn't join the NKFD, life in Soviet captivity was a waiting game. They had no idea when they would be released. The war ended in May 1945, but that didn't mean freedom. The Soviets kept them imprisoned year after year. Some generals tried to maintain their dignity and military bearing. They organized themselves according to rank. They held discussions about military history and strategy. They tried to keep their minds active. But as the years dragged on, hope faded. Letters from home were rare and heavily censored. Some generals received word that their families believed they were dead. Others learned that their homes had been destroyed and their families scattered. The Germany they had known was gone, divided between East and West, occupied by foreign powers. The psychological toll was enormous. Some generals became depressed. A few attempted suicide. Others simply withdrew into themselves, going through the motions of daily life without hope or purpose. While the generals lived in relative isolation in special camps, the millions of ordinary German soldiers captured by the Soviets faced a very different fate. And understanding their experience puts the generals' treatment in stark perspective. For the average German soldier captured on the Eastern Front, Soviet captivity was a death sentence. The conditions were horrific, and the mortality rate was staggering. When German soldiers surrendered or were captured, they were often forced to march hundreds of miles to transit camps or railheads. These marches, especially in winter, were brutal. Men who were already exhausted, wounded, or sick were forced to walk for days with minimal food or water. Those who couldn't keep up were shot or left to die. The march from Stalingrad is the most infamous example. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered there in February 1943, thousands died on the march to Soviet camps. They were already starving and frostbitten from months of siege. The Soviets gave them almost no food. They marched through sub-zero temperatures. Bodies lined the route. Those who survived the marches were sent to transit camps, where they were processed before being sent to labor camps. The transit camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and deadly. Typhus, dysentery, and other diseases spread rapidly. Medical care was non-existent. Men died by the hundreds. At some transit camps, prisoners were kept in open pens with no shelter. In winter, this was a death sentence. Men froze to death at night. In summer, they died of exposure and dehydration. The Soviets made no effort to provide adequate shelter or food. The attitude seemed to be that German prisoners were expendable. Those who survived the transit camps were sent to labor camps throughout the Soviet Union. These camps were part of the Gulag system, and German POWs were put to work alongside Soviet political prisoners and criminals. The work was backbreaking. German prisoners were forced to mine coal, cut timber, build railroads, and work in factories. The quotas were impossible. If you didn't meet your quota, your food ration was cut. If you couldn't work, you were left to starve. The conditions were brutal. In Siberia and the Arctic, prisoners worked in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius or lower. They had inadequate clothing and no protection from the elements. Frostbite was common. Many men lost fingers, toes, or limbs. The food was barely enough to keep you alive. A typical daily ration was a bowl of watery soup, a piece of black bread, and occasionally some kasha. It was maybe 1,000 calories a day, far less than what a man doing hard physical labor needs. Prisoners lost weight rapidly. Many became walking skeletons. Medical care was minimal. Sick or injured prisoners were given basic treatment, but nothing more. If you couldn't work, you were seen as useless. Many men who became too sick or weak to work were simply left to die. The death toll. The mortality rate among German POWs in Soviet captivity was horrific. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 400,000 and 1 million German soldiers died in Soviet camps. That's a mortality rate of somewhere between 13% and 33%, depending on which estimates you use. The highest mortality rates were in the first years after capture. Of the 91,000 Germans who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 survived to return home. That's a mortality rate of over 93%. Most died in the first year of captivity from starvation, disease, and exposure. Even for those captured later in the war, when conditions were somewhat better, the death toll was staggering. German soldiers captured in 1944 and 1945 still faced years of hard labor, inadequate food, and brutal conditions. Thousands died even after the war ended. The contrast between the treatment of generals and ordinary soldiers was stark. While generals lived in special camps with adequate food and no forced labor, ordinary soldiers were worked to death in the gulag. While generals were interrogated and pressured to cooperate, ordinary soldiers were simply exploited for their labor until they died or became too weak to work. This wasn't an accident. The Soviets made a calculated decision about how to treat different categories of prisoners. Generals were valuable for intelligence and propaganda purposes. Ordinary soldiers were just labor, and labor was expendable. Some might argue that the generals deserved harsher treatment. After all, they were the ones who had planned and commanded the campaigns that killed millions of Soviet citizens. They were the ones who bore responsibility for the atrocities committed by German forces on the Eastern Front. But the Soviets didn't see it that way. They saw the generals as assets to be exploited, and ordinary soldiers as a resource to be used up. It was a cold, pragmatic calculation that reflected Stalin's view of human life as expendable in service of the state. The long wait for freedom. As the years passed, the question of when German POWs would be released became increasingly urgent. The war had ended in 1945, but by 1950, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were still in Soviet custody. Their families had no idea if they were alive or dead. The German government, divided between East and West, had limited ability to negotiate for their release. The first major release of German POWs came in 1949, 4 years after the war ended. The Soviets announced that they would begin releasing prisoners who were sick, disabled, or otherwise unable to work. This was presented as a humanitarian gesture, but in reality, it was a practical decision. These men were no longer useful as labor, so there was no point in keeping them. Thousands of men were released in 1949 and 1950, but they were a fraction of those still held. And the men who came back told horrific stories of what they had endured. They were emaciated, sick, and traumatized. Many had lost limbs to frostbite. Others were so psychologically damaged that they could barely function. The releases also revealed the extent of the death toll. Families who had hoped their loved ones would return learned that they had died years earlier in Soviet camps. The news was devastating, but the generals were not among those released. The Soviets kept them imprisoned year after year. By 1950, men like Paulus and Weidling had been in Soviet custody for 5 to 7 years. They had no idea when or if they would ever be released. The Soviets had several reasons for keeping the generals. First, they were still useful for propaganda purposes. The Soviets could point to these high-ranking Nazi officers and say, "Look, even they recognized that Hitler was wrong." Second, the Soviets were concerned about what would happen if these men were released. Would they face trial for war crimes? Would they become symbols for neo-Nazi movements? It was safer to keep them locked up. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the generals were bargaining chips. As the Cold War intensified, The Soviets saw German POWs as leverage in negotiations with West Germany. They could offer to release prisoners in exchange for political concessions or economic aid. The breakthrough came in 1955, 10 years after the war ended. Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of West Germany, traveled to Moscow to negotiate with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. One of Adenauer's top priorities was securing the release of the remaining German POWs. The negotiations were difficult. Khrushchev demanded that West Germany establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and recognize East Germany as a legitimate state. Adenauer refused to recognize East Germany, but he did agree to establish diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. In exchange, Khrushchev agreed to release the remaining German POWs. In September 1955, the Soviets announced that they would release all German prisoners still in Soviet custody. Over the next few months, thousands of men were sent home. Among them were the surviving generals. Field Marshal Paulus was released in October 1953, after more than 10 years in Soviet captivity. He chose to settle in East Germany rather than return to West Germany, where he would have faced trial for war crimes. He died in 1957. General Helmuth Weidling was released in 1955, but died just a few months later, still in Soviet custody, before he could return to Germany. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach was released in 1955 and returned to West Germany, where he faced years of legal battles over his cooperation with the Soviets. He was eventually cleared of treason charges, but remained a controversial figure until his death in 1976. General Vinzenz Müller was released in 1955 and settled in East Germany, where he joined the East German military and rose to the rank of Chief of Staff. He died in 1961. The 1955 releases were supposed to be the end of the story. The Soviets claimed that all German POWs had been released. But this wasn't entirely true. A few prisoners remained in Soviet custody, either because they had been convicted of war crimes or because they had been reclassified as criminals rather than POWs. The last known German POW was released in 1956, 11 years after the war ended. But even then, there were persistent rumors that some Germans remained in Soviet camps, forgotten or deliberately hidden. These rumors were never confirmed, but they added to the sense that the full story of German POWs in Soviet captivity would never be known. For the generals who survived Soviet captivity and returned to Germany, life was complicated. They were no longer the powerful commanders they had once been. They were old men, broken by years of imprisonment, returning to a country that had been divided and transformed. Field Marshal Paulus chose to live in East Germany, where he was treated as a hero by the communist government. He had cooperated with the Soviets, joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, and denounced Hitler. The East German government saw him as proof that even high-ranking Nazis could be reformed. But in West Germany, Paulus was seen as a traitor. He had surrendered at Stalingrad, breaking Hitler's order to fight to the last man. He had cooperated with the Soviets and made propaganda broadcasts. Many Germans, especially former soldiers, never forgave him. He lived quietly in East Germany until his death in 1957, largely isolated from his former comrades. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach returned to West Germany in 1955 and immediately faced legal problems. He was charged with treason for his cooperation with the Soviets and his role in the National Committee for a Free Germany. The trial dragged on for years. Seydlitz argued that he had acted out of conviction, believing that ending the war quickly was the only way to save Germany. The charges were eventually dropped in 1956, but his reputation was permanently damaged. He spent the rest of his life defending his actions and died in 1976, still a controversial figure. General Vinzenz Müller settled in East Germany and joined the National People's Army, the military of Communist East Germany. He rose to the rank of Chief of Staff and became one of the highest-ranking former Wehrmacht officers in the East German military. He died in 1961, reportedly by suicide, though the circumstances were never fully explained. General Helmuth Weidling never made it home. He was released from Soviet custody in 1955, but died in a Soviet hospital in November of that year, just weeks before he was scheduled to return to Germany. He was 55 years old. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but some historians believe he may have been deliberately poisoned by the Soviets to prevent him from testifying about the final days of the war in Berlin. Other generals who survived and returned to Germany faced similar challenges. Some were tried for war crimes, others lived quietly, trying to rebuild their lives. A few wrote memoirs, attempting to explain their actions and defend their decisions. But most were forgotten, their stories overshadowed by the larger narrative of Germany's defeat and division. Even today, more than 70 years after the end of World War II, there are unanswered questions about German generals in Soviet captivity. How many generals were actually captured? Soviet records are incomplete, and some documents were destroyed. Historians have identified at least 50 to 60 German generals who were held in Soviet custody at some point, but the exact number may never be known. How many died in captivity? Again, the records are incomplete. We know that some generals died in Soviet custody, like General Helmuth Weidling, but others simply disappeared from the records, and their fate is unknown. What happened to the intelligence they provided? The Soviets interrogated German generals extensively, extracting information about German military capabilities, strategies, and plans. Some of this intelligence was used during the war, but what happened to it afterward? Was it shared with other countries? Was it used to develop Soviet military doctrine? The answers are still classified in Russian archives. Why did some generals cooperate while others resisted? This is perhaps the most complex question. Men like Paulus and Seydlitz joined the National Committee for a Free Germany and cooperated with Soviet propaganda efforts. Others, like General Ferdinand Heim, refused to cooperate despite years of pressure. What made the difference? Was it conviction, survival instinct, psychological breakdown? Each case was different, and the motivations were complex. And finally, were all the generals actually released? The Soviets claimed that all German POWs were released by 1956, but there were persistent rumors that some remained in Soviet camps, either forgotten or deliberately hidden. These rumors were never confirmed, but they reflect the deep mistrust that existed between Germany and the Soviet Union even after the war. The story of German generals in Soviet captivity is a complicated one. These were men who had served a brutal regime, who had commanded armies that committed atrocities, and who bore responsibility for the deaths of millions. They were not innocent victims, but they were also human beings who endured years of imprisonment, uncertainty, and psychological pressure. Some cooperated with their captors, others resisted. All of them paid a price for their service to Hitler's regime. The contrast between their treatment and the treatment of ordinary German soldiers is striking. While generals lived in special camps with adequate food and no forced labor, hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers died in the gulag, worked to death, or killed by starvation and disease. This reflects the cold pragmatism of Stalin's regime, which saw human beings as resources to be exploited or discarded based on their usefulness. For the families of German POWs, both generals and ordinary soldiers, the years of uncertainty were agonizing. Many spent years not knowing if their loved ones were alive or dead. When the prisoners finally came home, they were often broken men, physically and psychologically damaged by their experiences. Today, the story of German POWs in Soviet captivity is not widely known, especially outside of Germany and Russia. It's overshadowed by the larger narrative of the Holocaust, the Nuremberg trials, and the division of Germany, but it's an important part of the history of World War II and its aftermath. It's a reminder that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. The consequences of war, the suffering and the trauma, continue for years, sometimes decades. It's a reminder that even in victory there are moral complexities and difficult questions about justice, revenge, and humanity. The German generals who survived Soviet captivity returned to a world that had moved on without them. The Germany they had known was gone, replaced by two new states divided by ideology and the Cold War. They were relics of a defeated regime, men whose decisions had led to catastrophe. But their story is worth remembering, not to excuse their actions or minimize their responsibility, but to understand the full human cost of the war. They were part of a system that brought unimaginable suffering to millions. And in the end, they too suffered, though their suffering was a fraction of what they had inflicted on others. The story of Hitler's generals and Stalin's gulag is one of the forgotten chapters of World War II. These men commanded armies, made decisions that affected millions, and served one of history's most evil regimes. When they were captured, they faced years of imprisonment, interrogation, and uncertainty. Some cooperated with their captors, others resisted. All of them paid a price. Their story, and the story of the millions of ordinary German soldiers who suffered and died in Soviet captivity, is a reminder of the human cost of war and the long shadow it casts over those who survive it.